Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
1,000 times I've failed, still your mercy remains. And should I stumble again, still I'm caught in your grace everlasting. Your light will shine when all else fades, never ending. Your glory goes beyond all things. My purpose remains the art of losing myself in bringing you praise everlasting. Your light will shine when all else fades, never ending. Your glory goes beyond all things. My heart and my soul, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out, Lord. Let justice and praise become my embrace, to love you from the inside out. Above all else, still my purpose remains the art of losing myself in bringing you praise everlasting. Your light will shine when all else fades, never ending. Your glory goes beyond all things. My heart and my soul, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out, Lord. Let justice and praise become my embrace, to love you from the inside out, everlasting. Your light will shine when all else fades, never ending. Your glory goes beyond all fame. And the cry of my heart is to bring you praise from the inside out. Lord, my soul cries out. My heart and my soul, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out, find you in the mystery, in oceans deep. My faith will stand. So I'll call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul rests in your embrace. I am yours, and you are mine. Your grace abounds in deepest waters. Your sovereign hand will be my guide. Where feet may fail and fear surrounds me, you've never failed, and you won't start now. So I will call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul rests in your embrace. I am yours, and you are mine. And you are mine. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the water wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. And I'll call upon your name and keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul rests in your embrace. I am yours, and you are mine.
Crosspoint fam, thanks for joining us. I know that this has been said lots, but I'll say it again. I really miss you guys. I think if we didn't realize it before, I think we all now truly appreciate the value of community. And I think we've just really come to understand how much we need each other. I will say that while it has been challenging and disappointing to not be able to gather together on Sunday morning like we typically do, it's also been really exciting to see that that has not prevented our church community from showing up for people. You guys keep showing up. You keep living out the truth that church is not a building. It's not a place. It's not a place we go to. It's a people. And you keep showing up, Crosspoint. So thank you. I also want to tell you that if you are looking for ways to participate in what we're up to as a community, there are several ways that you can contribute financially. You can do that through stocks, through PayPal, through mail-in checks, through debit card. And so to do any of those, you're going to want to go to crosspoint.org/contribute, or you can text crosspointenc to 77977, and if you do that, a link will be sent straight to your phone. You just click on that, and then you can decide how you want to give. Speaking of this community that we all get to participate in, I want to tell you about something special that our community is celebrating this evening. So tonight at 6 o'clock in the parking lot, with every single social distancing measure and precaution in place, we are celebrating the class of 2020. And this wild school year, their last year of high school, is finally in the books. And our seniors throughout the last week have participated in very unconventional graduation ceremonies, and so they're actually graduates now. And so I just want to take a moment to reflect on that, just to think about what graduation actually means in a person's progression as a human being. Graduation really is that moment where we mark that a person is transitioning from childhood to adulthood. Now, for all of us that have already made that transition, none of us made that in the midst of a global pandemic. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be a member of the class of 2020 and try to navigate the uncertainty of taking those steps into adulthood for the very first time in a world where everything is unpredictable and seemingly unstable, and none of the adults really seem to have very good answers. But it also is a good reminder that for any of us, when we find ourselves uncertain and unstable and fearful, that we want to lean into community. And the good news for our graduates is that they do not have to do this alone. They are supported and they are loved by this community. This community is rooting for them and praying for them. And so we want the class of 2020 to know that as they take this momentous step into adulthood, that their Crosspoint family is cheering them on. Now, I wish that our whole church community could literally cheer them on tonight at senior recognition, but in order to protect the health and safety of our graduates and their families, we had to limit senior recognition to immediate family of our graduates. However, I want to take time for us to really appreciate that this is something that we do together as a church community, even if, like many things we've done lately, we can't all be together in person. Crosspoint, while this is a celebration of our graduates, it is also a celebration of the Crosspoint community. Each of these graduates is a precious soul that has been loved and nurtured by this community. Our community has put God's heart on display in the lives of these students week in and week out. And they, in turn, have served as faithful volunteers in our church, particularly in Kids Point. They've been small group leaders, they've been large group leaders, they've run tech, they've led worship, and so today we celebrate them. And we get to come alongside them and say, job well done. And we get to celebrate all that you have done for them as a community, Crosspoint, to love them and to faithfully show them the way of Jesus week in and week out. So I want to say to you, first, thank you, Crosspoint. Thank you for the way that you have invested and loved these students. And I want to say, well done, Crosspoint community. However, I think that it would mean a lot more to hear this from the students themselves than for me to keep talking. So we interviewed the class of 2020, and we asked them to reflect on what their Crosspoint community means to them. In a moment, you are going to hear some of the highlights of their responses. If you would like to hear the entirety of their responses, I encourage you after the service to go over to the Student Ministry YouTube channel, and you can hear the full videos there. But for now, Crosspoint, I want to present to you the graduating class of 2020.
Something I'm grateful for about my time at Crosspoint is definitely the friendships I made throughout elementary, middle, and high school, and just being able to connect with a lot of people from different schools.
I'm very grateful for the adult leaders at Crosspoint. They've always been very open and considerate of me and all the other students. I'm very thankful that I've had them in my life when I've had questions or concerns regarding anything.
I'm grateful for the many connections I've made with fellow students, leaders, and God in a comfortable and accepting environment.
Something I'm grateful for about my time at Crosspoint is all of the relationships that I was able to make with my time there.
I'm grateful for all the people I've met and all the friendships I've created at Crosspoint.
I'm thankful for Crosspoint because it gave me my best friend for life, Anna Doherty.
A value that I've learned from my time at Crosspoint has been to just be kind and welcoming to people, because that can mean the world to somebody who's having a bad day or just isn't used to being treated like that.
A value that Crosspoint has really taught me over my years here is the value of inclusiveness. Every other church I've ever gone to really didn't have so many different people from so many different walks of life than Crosspoint does. And just over my time here, I've just learned to love people like Jesus loved people, no matter what defining factor they have about them. And it's just really something I can carry into my life.
Throughout my time at Crosspoint, I think learning the value of loving others the way Jesus loves and treating people really well is something that has helped me and will continue to help me throughout the course of my life.
The value that I've learned through my time at Crosspoint is always putting others before yourself.
Some of my favorite values that I've learned from Crosspoint over the years are selflessness and humility. I've learned so much about the impacts you can make when you put others' needs before your own, and the amount you can learn if you just take a step back and look at the people around you, whether they're first graders on Sunday mornings or adults preaching during rhythm. You can learn so much from the people around you if you just take a step back and pay attention.
I want to say thank you to Crosspoint for being such an inviting and loving church. Thank you guys for the Open Arms program. Honestly, without it, my family wouldn't have come to Crosspoint, and I wouldn't be the person that I am today. I want to say thank you to JT for being an amazing pastor, and every single message that you've given, I've really related to, and I'm really grateful for that. I want to say thank you to my small group for being such an inviting and encouraging group of girls, and for being there when I need it. I want to say thank you to Tracy and Margie for being amazing small group leaders and for encouraging me to follow my dreams. And I want to give a big shout out to Bonnie for helping me get involved at Crosspoint with the volunteering.
I would like to say thank you to Bonnie, my volunteer leader, and to all the kids who have made all the classes a blast, and to all the people who have made my Crosspoint experience memorable.
I would like to tell JT how amazing I think she is, and her heart for students is so obvious, and she's so greatly appreciated. I would like Jonathan Bowe to know how much I appreciate his leadership. Tracy and Margie, I would like you to know how much I appreciate you checking in on me and making me feel cared about all the time.
To all of my leaders and co-volunteers at Crosspoint, thank you so much for everything, and I'm going to miss you so much.
To everyone at Crosspoint, especially Bonnie and all the leaders and all the volunteers and Kids Point, I just wanted to say thank you, and that I will honestly never forget my time there. And you guys just made me feel so loved.
I would like to thank Tracy for being the best leader that I could ask for since the very beginning, Margie for always being there to listen to us complain about the trials of our teenage years. I would also like to thank JT for encouraging us to grow together and individually. And overall, Crosspoint has really been a constant throughout my life, despite the dramas of elementary school, the embarrassment of middle school, and finally the turmoil of high school. And I've always counted on Sundays remaining the same, despite some changes in physical appearance. And as I continue to move on in life, I will forever carry a piece of Crosspoint with me.
Today we find ourselves wrapping up a series of teachings that we've been in the last several weeks called Stuck. And in the middle of our both literal and figurative state of stuckness, there's a question that has come up a lot. It's come up in me. I've heard it from a lot of different people. And it's this question of how in the world, in the midst of all this chaos and anger and fear and uncertainty, can I find any sort of peace? And not only how can I find peace, but how can I contribute to peace? In a world where there's so much division and so much uncertainty and hurt and pain and confusion, how can I contribute to peace in the world? Jesus says something at the beginning of one of his most famous sermons, the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And this is an idea we try to revisit a lot here at Crosspoint because we need to be reminded on a continual basis that that's very different than blessed are the peacekeepers, right? I mean, peacekeepers, that's that idea that we see if you've read the books, The Hunger Games, or seen the movies, where you have the peacekeepers, right? Those that use all sorts of threat and intimidation and violence to try to keep everyone in order, to try to keep peace. And so they're called peacekeepers. But that's very, very different than what Jesus is talking about here when he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Now, throughout the scriptures, the word peace comes from this Hebrew word called shalom. And this word shalom has all sorts of nuance and all sorts of depth and beauty to it. But when you and I tend to think about peace, we tend to think about this ethereal feeling that may come over us, like this Zen-like type experience. Or when we think of peace, we tend to think of just the absence of conflict, that there's no more war going on, and whether that's war between nations, or sometimes it's just the absence of conflict in our own homes, where we don't have to have the tension anymore. We don't have to have the rolling of the eyes. We don't have to have this sense that I'm walking on eggshells all the time. We don't have to have this sense where there's screaming and yelling and people throwing things. And it's just, could I get rid of all of that and just have some peace? And while this word, this Hebrew word shalom, certainly carries with it this idea of the absence of conflict, it's much bigger than that. It's much broader and has way more depth and nuance to it than that. In fact, throughout the scriptures, when it uses the word shalom, it refers to this participation and to the restoring of things to wholeness. Where something is broken, it's being made whole again. And so one of the things to understand about shalom is that shalom isn't static. Shalom is active. And it begs the question, is what are you and I going to do with our energy and our resources and our voices to advance shalom in the world? That we are invited to be people who look around and to try to notice, where is something cracked? Where is something broken in our culture, in our relationships, in our societal systems, in ourselves? Where is something cracked and broken? And what are you and I going to do with our energy to bring shalom to it? What are you and I going to do to try to bring wholeness to it and health to it and repair to it? This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But oftentimes we get those two ideas confused, right? This idea of peacekeeping and peacemaking. And we can do that in our homes, and we can do it in all sorts of our relationships at times, where what we find ourselves doing is just trying to figure out how do we keep the peace. But when we get committed to trying to figure out ways to keep the peace, we'll do all sorts of things that are often unwise and often toxic. We'll lie to try to keep peace so that someone doesn't find out the truth and things don't explode, and so we'll lie. Or we'll avoid confronting difficult things and difficult topics, confronting someone that needs to be confronted because, you know what, I just want to keep peace. We'll enable destructive behavior. We'll let destructive behavior continue on We'll ignore things. We'll spend money in all sorts of unwise ways. We'll intimidate other people just to try to keep peace. But the same is true on a national level and at a global level and a cultural level, where many times the goal becomes to keep peace. But when the goal becomes to keep peace, it becomes very easy to justify all sorts of brutal and violent actions. And we've seen this, right? We know this. It can become about who can shame or who can threaten better to shut the other side up, who can leverage violence better to shut the other side up. And that's what we can view as keeping peace. But again, simply compliance or quiet or lack of conflict isn't peace. We have to remember that peace isn't the thing that we get when someone finally agrees with us. That peace isn't the result of you or I finally dominating or conquering someone else. That's peacekeeping. But that's nothing like peacemaking. And as people pursuing the way of Jesus, what you and I are invited into is to be peacemakers, shalom bringers, people that are invited to contribute to the healing and the restoration of creation, of relationships, of systems, of hierarchical structures that oppress others in all aspects of our lives, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our offices, on social media, in public, in private. That's what we're invited to do. But one of the ways that we get stuck many times in this is that we end up mistaking peacemaking for then always being quiet or being passive or compliant or subdued. I love how one author, Ashita Moore, she puts it this way. She writes, "Peace can be fierce at times, and it has to, because violence and discord and injustice won't go down without a fight. We need people with passion to enter into the work of peacemaking." But again, we often get stuck in this, especially people trying to follow Jesus, because many times it comes down to our misunderstandings of the teachings of Jesus and the Gospels and the Gospel writers and what they were communicating. We have to understand that the Gospel writers were incredibly subversive politically. And so when people say, just leave politics out of things, the Gospel writers were incredibly politically subversive. Even when they refer to Jesus as the Son of God, or they write phrases like Jesus is Lord, we tend to think that they're just making merely theological statements about the divinity of Christ. And it's not that it doesn't include that. I want to be clear on that. But I also want to be clear that just as much, and arguably even more, what they're doing when they say that is they're calling out the power structures and the leader of the Roman Empire. They're calling out Caesar, who called himself the Son of God and who dictated that people call him the Son of God. And where the chants were throughout the Roman Empire, Caesar is Lord. So, at the height of the Roman Empire, when these gospel writers are writing the teachings of Jesus and writing about the life and teachings of Jesus, and they write that Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus is Lord, they're contrasting in a very blatant and subversive way. They're contrasting the Roman Empire with the kingdom of God. And they're saying, you know what, the way of Caesar and the power structures and the systems and the hierarchy and the oppression of the government of the time, it is out of alignment with God's vision for the world. They're declaring very clearly that the world that they were living in and the power structures in the world were out of alignment with shalom. Now, another way we get stuck, though, is we hear that and we can find ourselves getting maybe even energized and motivated to say, I want to step into something like that. I want to be a part of something like that. But then we see Jesus say things like, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And we get stuck because we start to think, okay, I want to participate in this bringing of shalom and this peacemaking. And I feel called to be wanting to participate in this way of healing what's been broken and resurrecting and reconciling relationships and social structures and order. I want to be a part of a movement that does that. And then Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn them the other also. And what we hear today oftentimes is, okay, well then just let yourself get walked on. That's the answer. Just let yourself get beat up. Let yourself get abused. And we go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, I don't know if I want to participate in that. Now, the context of this is really important. And so just to help us visualize something, maybe, if you have someone with you, you can put them in front of you face to face. If you don't have someone with you, maybe grab a pillow or something, just where you can see what Jesus is talking about and you can see it visualized. So when Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, so the person in front of you, their right cheek. Now, again, we have to keep in mind that no one in this culture used their left hand. Your left hand was seen as cursed. So you would never use your left hand in this kind of a moment. It was a completely dominated right-handed culture. So when Jesus says, if someone strikes you on your right cheek, there's only one way to do that. And it's to hit someone with the back of your hand. And not surprisingly, just as that kind of an action is seen today, then this was seen as demeaning. This was seen as a way to treat someone as inferior or less than you if you would slap them with the back of your hand. This was a statement about who they are and where they fit in the social hierarchy and who you were and your dominance over them, that you would strike someone with the back of your hand. The only people that you would punch with a closed fist were people that you saw as equals. Someone who is a peer, someone on the same social hierarchy and level as you. And so what Jesus is referring to here is it says when someone strikes you on the right cheek, the only way to do that, right, is for someone to strike you with the back of your hand. You can't hit someone's right cheek with your fist. You have to wrap around. It doesn't work. So it says if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. So what Jesus says is, okay, if someone demeans you, if someone is treating you inferior or less than in that moment, here's what I want to invite you to do. Turn to them the other also. So you turn your left cheek. Now, by doing that, this is the spot that you put the oppressor in. You put them in a position where they have to do one of two things. They either have to punch you, because now your left cheek is exposed. The only way they can hit you is with a closed fist. And by doing so, treat you as an equal or as a peer. Or they have to walk away, because now they're left with no other option. When you turn your left cheek to them, there's no way that you can slap somebody with your back of your hand then on the left cheek. And so the beauty of what Jesus is talking about here is says, okay, if the oppressor is forced to punch you, then by doing so, it disrupts the power and the social hierarchy of the time. People watching and looking around would see that, wait a second, you are treating and acknowledging this person as the same as equal. That changes things culturally and how people interacted and lived and did life with one another. But if the oppressor walks away, then the violence is stopped. You've stopped the violence and exposed the injustice of what was happening. And so what we have to understand is this isn't this passive and despair of doing nothing, but it's also not this corresponding act of violence and antagonism and injustice. And it's within that tension, this thing that I like to call the loving resistance, where it's not the passivity of doing nothing, and it's not recycling violence and antagonism and further injustice, but within the tension is this loving resistance, this way of the loving resistance. And I think this is what Jesus invites us into. And so with our last few moments together, what I want to do is I want to unpack what I think that means and give you some handles and some filters to pass some thoughts through when we're trying to figure out what does it look like to live in the loving resistance, to contribute to peace in such a way that it exists in the loving resistance, that how we contribute to peace and into shalom in the world. How do we do that? What are some filters that we can pass thoughts and ideas through? So I want to give you some as we wrap this up. Just a few quick thoughts on that. Number one is to refuse to participate in words and actions that dehumanize other human beings. That we would refuse to participate in words and actions that dehumanize other human beings. When you look at the word resistance in the dictionary, it actually describes it this way. It says, resistance is the refusal to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument. And so being part of this loving resistance, this way of loving resistance, is to refuse to accept or comply with oppression of any kind. To say, you know what, I don't want to participate in anything that dehumanizes, that demeans another human being by what I say or by what I do. That I want to live in such a way that I'm always honoring and dignifying the image of God in every single human being. That's a filter that we need to pass things through when we consider ideas and things that we're going to consider doing and living and acting in a way of peace. That we don't dehumanize people. Now, whenever you say that, there's all sorts of questions that come up oftentimes. And people many times want to take really extreme examples and they're like, okay, well, what happens when you're dealing with a narcissist? What happens when you're dealing with a sociopath? What happens when you're facing an army that the only way that they view success is if when you're dead? What do you do then? And yes, it raises questions, right? Raises questions, extreme examples of, what happens when someone breaks into your house? Of course. These are extreme examples of stuff that's very real and it's out there. But we can't judge it by extreme examples of violence. So we can't judge our reactions and how we live in this way of loving resistance. We can't answer all the questions of what does that mean for military? What does that mean for everything else? Of course, those are questions we should wrestle with. And I think those are questions worth passing through that filter, even though we may end up sometimes with different answers as we consider all the different ways. But what I'm most concerned about, and what you and I should be most concerned about, is what about us in our day-to-day lives? Not in the extremes, but in our day-to-day lives. What does it look like to refuse to demean people, to refuse to dehumanize people in our words and our actions, wherever that is, face-to-face, online, in email, and things that we promote and things that we share, things that we do participate in? How do we refuse to participate in things that dehumanize and demean others? Secondly, pre-decide what creative courage looks like in the context of community. There is so much beauty and wisdom and health when we can dialogue about these things, and when we can have conversations about these things, and when we can discuss what does it look like to respond. What does it look like to respond well in the face of injustice? What does it look like to respond well in the face of relational brokenness? How do we do that? How do we engage well? But in order to do that, we have to pre-decide what creative courage looks like rather than only relying on our emotion in the moment. Because the reality is, there are some times where you have no time to discuss, no time to think about it. But there are many, many, many situations that we can anticipate, that we can think through, that we can wrestle through in the context of community and say, how do we want to respond in that moment? From the time our kids have been really little, so one of the things that we've tried to do in all sorts of different ways, to always talk through situations and scenarios. If you find yourself in this situation that might be dangerous, if you find yourself in this situation when you could feel stuck between, hey, how your social standing and how you feel like you should respond, or what the right thing to do is or the wrong thing to do is. I've got a son who's getting ready to go off to college, who's graduating this weekend. And we've had lots of conversations about when you find yourself in this situation in school. And maybe it's you're watching an injustice happen. Maybe it's in a situation where you have to make a choice or a decision, and you find yourself in this moment or in this situation, these circumstances. Let's talk about how do you want to respond in that moment. Let's talk through those scenarios. Let's talk about how do we get creative? How do you show creative courage in that way? How do you manage all the different tensions? But those are conversations that we have in advance so that hopefully it allows, our kids and allows us to pre-decide how are we going to handle that moment when it comes. Because the research and studies show that we are significantly more likely to make the choice we want to make when we have pre-decided and thought through those situations. We see this happen with Rosa Parks in the civil rights movement, where Rosa Parks, when she didn't get out of her seat on the bus, that was something they had discussed beforehand. That she was part of a movement of people that they had discussed and talked about the best way to approach the injustices that they were facing, and had pre-decided, okay, this is the moment, and Rosa's not going to get out of her seat. And what they decided lived in this way of the loving resistance. It wasn't the passivity of doing nothing, and it wasn't the continual recycling of violence and antagonism and more injustice. And so, friends, this is what you and I are invited to do. We're invited to have these conversations so that we don't just let the emotion of the moment dictate our words and actions. And it's tough to have peace when you haven't had conversations in the context of community with people that you trust. And Crosspoint, this is one of the beautiful things that we get to do together. That we get to bounce ideas off of one another, that we get to wrestle through ideas. How do we want to approach this issue of relational brokenness? That I have someone I can talk to about that. How do I want to act in this moment? How do I want to respond to this injustice? What can we do? How can we participate in bringing shalom and healing and peace to this particular situation and circumstances? That we talk about that. We talk about real things that matter in every aspect of our life, and we can pre-decide what creative courage looks like, but we can do it in the context of community. One last filter that I want to give you is to encourage you to stay grounded in time-tested wisdom that is beyond the most recent headlines. That you and I would stay grounded in time-tested wisdom that is beyond the most recent headlines. One of the things you hear often right now is people saying things like, you know what, it's just never been like this. It's never been like this. And the fact of the matter is, it's bad right now, but this isn't new. In the big picture of the world and understanding of history, this isn't new. And when you think and embrace this idea of this, it's never been this bad, that often leads to a sense of panic and overwhelmedness and stuckness in us, because we feel like we're, as a society and as a culture and as a people, that we are braving a world that has never been experienced, or we're wrestling with questions that have never been tackled before. But while it's bad, it's not new. And it's one of the reasons that we as a community keep coming around this ancient library of text and of books that we call the Bible. Because within the scriptures, we find thousands of year-old wisdom and questions of people wrestling with the very questions of, like, what do you do when you feel like the political power structures have lost their mind? What do you do? How do you act? What do you do when you see a widening gap between the rich and the poor that's causing more and more issues? What do you do? What do you do when it feels like that people that are close to you don't understand what you feel like the Spirit of God is doing in you and where the Spirit of God is leading you, and they start to distance themselves from you? They start to call you names, and they start to walk away from you. What do you do when it looks like religion starts getting used as a weapon by all sorts of people and even by government? What do you do in those moments? See, these are questions that people thousands of years ago were wrestling with. These aren't new questions. And so for us, we're invited to ask questions like, why were these stories and these events and these songs and these poems, why were they told? And why were they written? And what were they trying to communicate? And what does this ancient library of books have to teach you and I today? And it's one of the reasons here at Crosspoint, we keep coming back to these stories and to this ancient wisdom that we want to unpack over and over again, because we want to wrestle with that. And friends, those types of questions of why was this told and why was this written? What were they trying to communicate? That is such, those are so much more important questions than how do I convince you that all of this literally happened exactly like this? Or so much more of an important question than how do I convince you that it didn't literally happen like this? all those questions that so many times in church and among Christians that people get caught up in, those questions are just really good at creating teams, of creating all sorts of dividing lines. But those questions aren't actually helpful for transformation. And so, friends, we come back to staying grounded in time-tested wisdom to say, we've all got these huge questions, and we don't want to just rely and go on the emotion of what we see in the moment in the latest headlines and social media, but we come back to these stories. And we're going to be doing that these next several weeks. We're going to enter into a new series where we're going to look at some of these ancient stories and poems and, critiques from the prophets and seeing what was being said, why were they saying that, and what does that have to do with you and I? But this ancient book in this library of books that we have as the Bible, so important, that grounds us in something much bigger than and much more time-tested than just the latest headlines of the moment. And friends, I want to remind you, this is what we do together. We get to participate in being peacemakers. We get to participate in bringing shalom. And it does not mean, please hear me on this, it does not mean that we all are activists. It shouldn't mean that we all are activists, but we can all be active. There's something that each of us can do to participate in shalom, to partner with the Spirit of Christ as we work toward reconciling and restoring and healing the brokenness in each of us. As we work toward restoring and reconciling our relationships with one another and our relationships with humanity as a whole, can work on restoring the brokenness in the ways that we view God and the way that we relate to God. That we can partner with the Spirit of Christ, reconciling and healing and restoring the brokenness in our own homes and the systems and the power structures that govern our world. All sorts of different ways that we can link arms, and that we all don't have to be activists. And we can feel the pressure of that at this moment right now. You don't have to be an activist, but we do all have to be called to figure out what's it look like to be active, to do something. And it may be listening. It may be I'm just committing to learning. It may be that you're going to speak up when you see certain injustices being spewed by people and certain dehumanizing words and language. It might simply be checking in on someone when they pop in your head and you think about them, because isolation is a really hard thing, and that you would just check on somebody and love them. We can all be active, that we can wrestle with where is something cracked or broken in our culture, in our relationships, in our schools, in our cafeterias, where is something broken, cracked in our youth sports teams, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, in our government, with our societal systems. Where are things cracked and broken within ourselves? And what are you and I going to do with our energy to bring shalom to it, to bring wholeness to it, to bring health to it, to bring repair to it? And I want to remind you, you can't do it all. Not even close. And it can feel so overwhelming right now because we feel like there's so much to do. You can't do it all, so don't even try. It will crush you and it will overwhelm you, and you will stay stuck if you try to do it all. But friends, I want to invite us to just do something. That there's countless small acts every single day that contribute to the loving resistance. And while you and I, you can't do it all individually, Crosspoint, we can do a lot together. And so, friends, here's to continuing to find ways to be peacemakers. Here's to continuing to find ways to bring shalom in our world. And here's to continuing to find ways to live and to act in the loving resistance together.
Welcome home.